But to help us hopefully understand, we are joined by former Eskom executive Vally Padayachee. We also have Hlathi Madela, who is SA Energy Forum Executive Director, and former Scopa Chair Themba Godi. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Vally, let me start with you. And to my point, saying listening to the DG, to me, as an ordinary South African, the explanation was as clear as mud. But what is your understanding, and what does this mean, in the bigger scheme of things? Vally?
Good evening, Kwena, and a very good evening to my fellow panelists, and a very good evening to the viewers as well. Now, for me, I think being long in the sector over 40 years, having come from Eskom and other parastatals and so on, it was not clear as mud. It was very clear as to what Eskom and National Treasury are intending. I must admit that before the acting DG, Mr. Ismail Momenit, gave that explanation, I was a bit concerned because from that superficial explanation that went out onto the media before he came on the air, it was not too clear, and I was concerned, given that I'm a stickler for governance, etc. But that said, I think we must give context to those actions that's been taken by Treasury and Eskom. What we must take cognizance of, we are in a national electricity crisis, and of course evidenced by the robust or significant load shedding. And key to stopping that load shedding and arresting the crisis is the national parastatal or the national state utility, Eskom. And if Eskom fails, which we cannot allow, then the consequences, I think, is common knowledge. The economy will fail and will have drastic consequences. So we are in a business unusual situation. We are in a crisis situation, and I've always said this. In a crisis situation, you take crisis decisions, right, without negating proper good governance and so on. Now, if I look at or analyze the decision taken by National Treasury and the Minister and the acting DG, in the context of Eskom's request, they haven't broken a rule. It's allowed for in the legislation. Transnet has been given that exemption last year, and this particular latitude has been given to address inter alia the crisis situation. And the acting DG has made it very clear that they're not hiding anything. Eskom will have to report it, but they'll have to report it in a different format, but it'll still be transparent. So I am comfortable, Kwena, at the stance and the decision taking in the context I've described. All
right. Let's park it there for now, and I want to bring in the other two guests also just to get their view on this. Themba, let me come to you, and from your understanding, is it clear what the intention is from Treasury in this move?
Well, I have understood what the DG has explained, but do I accept it? No. When I was still chairing Scopa, when we dealt with issues around deviations and expansions, Eskom and Transnet were always the leading culprits in terms of having procurement running into billions of rands that they had to do shortcuts. And we know that last year, Pravin Gordhan applied to National Treasury for Eskom to be exempted from following procurement processes that everybody is subjected to. And that was granted. Andre de Ruyter applied for the Preferential Procurement Framework Act as well to be put aside. And here we are again, we have an arrangement that that is actually very ironic in relation to the current administration, that came to power on the promise and basis of transparency and accountability. And after being in charge 5 years down the line, we find these unusual arrangements being made for Eskom. And I think one of the areas that we may need to look at is essentially what is it that has led us to where we are. Let's take away the issues around electricity crisis, onerous international requirements. It's very simple. If you read the letter by the minister, the main cause is that Eskom has inadequate internal controls, because of which they can't give accurate and complete instances of irregular expenditure, fruitless and wasteful expenditure. And that therefore becomes a basis for their qualification, and they want to run away from that.
All right, Hlathi, let me bring you in and picking up from the point that Themba is making. And for me, why I said that the explanation was as clear as mud is the usage of words. And when we talk fruitless expenditure, it almost comes out as, when you say fruitless and wasteful expenditure, it's something that should not happen, but it sounds like we're covering it up. Hlathi, your perspective and perception of this?
Well, good evening to you, host, to my fellow panelists and the viewers of Newzroom. Let me quickly just bring up to speed the audience what is meant by this. I'm not an expert in this. I'm reading it as it is from the PFMA. It says in terms of Section 81, 1B and 83, 1B of the Public Finance Management Act, an accounting officer and an accounting authority shall commit an act of financial misconduct if that accounting officer or accounting authority makes or permits irregular expenditure. So, of course, the word that is problematic is fruitless. It appears that irregular expenditure is catered for, or whoever is a presiding officer may apply to indulge in irregular expenditure. I'm going to differ from what I have read today and what I've heard today. Let's just talk about Eskom. Eskom has been involved in many irregular expenditures. The problem is when these irregular expenditures don't suit a certain group of people, we get the noise that we're getting, and that's why I'm a little bit despondent today, because I'll tell you now, there's nothing regular about the independent power producers that Eskom buys electricity for 5 rand 25 cents and resell it for 98 cents. There is nothing regular about the coal procurement contracts of Eskom. There is nothing regular about the current procurement of the battery energy storage system, where Eskom is giving contract to the private sector to be able to borrow money from the African Bank as well as the New Development Bank for their own profits on the back of Eskom contract, and Eskom itself cannot build this battery energy storage system for themselves. There has been irregular expenditure and there has been an abuse of the public money at every level. Here's a question that I've always asked. Why is it that when you are a private entity and you pick up a contract with a public entity like Eskom, why are you not subjected to the same scrutiny that we are subjecting Eskom to today? Private companies that are doing business with Eskom, they do 10 times more of this irregular expenditure and fruitless expenditure, but they cannot be held into account because they don't have to abide by the Public Finance Management Act. So we are really in the doom and in the gloom here, because the very same people who thrive off doing business with the states, they can do as they please. They don't even define it as irregular expenditure and fruitless expenditure. So I'm saying this media is biased, it is insulting. Let's reverse the table. Let's look at what they do before we critique it too much into what Eskom is being allowed to do. We don't like it, but it's happening with the private sector that is doing business with the states. That's my opinion.
Vali, let me bring you in here and just on the issue of the usage of words irregular, wasteful, and fruitless in that regard. Don't you think maybe that could be where the challenge to many people is, and especially because we are dealing with an entity, as Hlathi has just explained, that does not have a good reputation, lack of a better phrasing, in the public eye?
I think, Krena, let's understand, and I'm going by what the acting DG has said, and I have a lot of respect for Mr. Ismail Mohamed. I've known him for the last 20 years. I haven't dealt directly with him, but I dealt under his watch in a number of companies that I've been in. He's one of the most efficient and most, when it comes to governance and so on, you can't get a guy that's more of a stickler than him. So that said, what he's indicated about an hour ago is that nothing is going to be hidden. It's going to be reported, but going to be reported in a different format. And just to get a detail, he indicated that in the annual report, it will not be reported in the annual statement section, but it will be reported in the other section. So what he is saying is that, and he's made it quite clear, they're actually going to be more tough on corruption incidents, but any irregular, fruitless, and wasteful expenditure, and here they're talking about what he terms, I think, very minor incidents of those, will still be reported. So that's why I take comfort in the fact that nothing is going to be hidden, but I am more concerned as an SA incorporator that if it's reported in the normal way, which other companies are not required to report to, then Eskom will trigger a qualified status. And if it triggers the qualified status, then it could run foul of the default of loans, etc., etc., and we could have a run on Eskom being completely depleted and not being capable of addressing the number of projects that's required to be executed to address the crisis situation. So that's where I'm coming from. I think this decision taken was a very prudent decision in the context of the crisis, and I'm in full support of that, exactly in the context of what the acting DG has explained. And it's within, they haven't broken any laws at the moment. They're doing it within the governance structures, and I think we must support it.
Themba?
Yeah, I think, look, for me, the question really is, 5 years or so into Pravin Gordhan's running of the ministry, and the 3 or so years that we had Andre de Ruyter in charge, does this represent an improvement, or does it signify a slide back? Because the issue of the loans and the default that is being brought up, to me, is a red herring. What is the age analysis of the loans that Eskom has? Unless if it is a 6-month-old loan that has these onerous requirements that if it gets a qualified audit opinion, it's going to trigger some sanctions. It has been receiving qualified audit opinions all along and have not triggered any backlash from the loans that it has. But for me, from a management point of view, and which I believe is the worry of the country, is that it appears as if the administration at Eskom has actually gotten worse. And that is why my question is, what has Pravin Gordhan been doing with Andre de Ruyter? If we have a situation where they worry that when irregular expenditure is put on the register, it is removed before it is assessed, that Eskom cannot give an accurate amount of irregular expenditure, that tells you that you have an entity that is being run by people who essentially either do not know what they are doing or things are actually just falling apart. For me, that is the point. I don't think that you are sending a signal that suggests that things are improving, things have improved. I mean, we have been told about how corruption is being fought, how people are being cleaned out of, government institutions. And yet here we are forced to take very extraordinary measures, allegedly to protect Eskom, because we are failing on the most basic of things. Inadequate internal controls. I mean, are you having a weak internal audit? Are you having a weak audit committee that is unable to do its work? Or are we dealing with a weak management that cannot process a report from internal audit? I mean, if that is what we're dealing with, then let us admit and say, well, that is what we're dealing with, and that all this noise about accountable and transparent governance since Ramaphosa came on board was just that. It was just talk. It was just one faction of the ANC taking the other one out so that they can, also have a share of the cake. I don't believe that this is done essentially to save Eskom. Than that,
yeah.
Look, we are debating here, and I would imagine that some of the people who have loaned Eskom are watching and listening, and they hear that we want to cheat them and present financial statements that have no irregular expenditure, and yet, in true fact, Eskom will be having a lot of unaccounted for irregular expenditure. It just does not come across well for me.
All right, we will continue the conversation, and I think, Hlathi, when I come to you, the question will be, was this or is this a political decision? But we'll get into that when we come back after this short break. Right, we continue our conversation with our three guests. As we did say just before the break, Hlathi, I did say that, I mean, if you look at this, and from what I'm understanding, is that the exemption in this context, will be, to a certain extent, to help Eskom with its balance sheet, but also to enable Eskom to be able to borrow again to invest, particularly in new transmission infrastructures and so on. But can we say, Hlathi, that this is purely a decision that has been taken to protect that balance sheet, or can we say that politics is also involved in this decision? especially from the revelations that we've had from the former chief in Andre de Ruyter as he was leaving Eskom. Hlathi?
Yeah, thank you for having me again. It's definitely got very little to do with balancing the books of Eskom, because we hear Eskom generation is not going to be allowed to borrow any money for new investments in the next 3 years. I'm quite surprised that the transmission part of Eskom is going to be allowed, which suits the independent power producers but doesn't suit the state being the main provider of electricity. But to answer your question, it's definitely a political maneuvering. It's very little to do with balancing the books because it's not clear. But also, I ask myself this very basic question to say, what do we make of all of this now? On one hand, Eskom is going to get a bailout of 254 billion rand in the next 3 years. We don't get told where that money is going to come from, where it's going to come from our taxes. National Treasury, I doubt if they have that money. On another hand, now, this very act of allowing Eskom to indulge in irregular expenditure is going to capacitate it to balance its books, and one division of it, which is transmission, to be able to go out on the market and borrow money. It seems to me people are having their way as they please, because we are not talking about Eskom in totality. We are talking about the select parts of Eskom to suit certain narratives. And therefore, it's just politics at play, and it's even immature politics at play, which does not really tell us how they're going to go about all of this. I guess it's early days, or it's one of those confusions again, where we are going to hear about the maneuvering again after 6 months from now. But I must be honest with you, I'm still very much confused to fundamentally understand what is it that they are trying to achieve, because I don't get to hear where the money is going to come from. I don't even get to hear what are those activities that Eskom is going to be allowed to indulge in irregular expenditures. While at the same time, I hear that Transnet actually applied for the same, but it was denied to them. So for me, to cut a long story short, I think the government is basically saying to us, they haven't figured out how to get the Eskom out of trouble. If I were to give them a solution, I would say if you're going to allow Eskom to indulge in irregular expenditure activities, you must also be willing to review all irregular contracts. If there's any contract there with the private sector and it is described as being irregular, also scrutinize it and do something about it. Maybe it will bring some money back home, or maybe it will result some of these expensive contracts being cancelled, like the IPPs, like the coal contracts, like some of the contracts for operation and maintenance. So we always get a squash as a government, as a public entity, and the private sector is not held into account, and the private sector is very quick to want to bring the rating agencies and hold the gun on the government head to say, the same thing that we are refusing to be applied at Eskom, if you apply it to us, you're going to scare the investors. Let us have a democratic country where the same rules that apply to Eskom are also applied to the private sector, and see what happens. So it's politics at play. Thank you.
Vally, I want to bring you in here because, I mean, and as you clarified, and from what the DG said, all irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure must still be detailed in the Eskom annual report, right? And also the irregular expenditure that occurs through, I guess, criminal activity or losses must also still be disclosed in the financial statement of the annual report. If that is the case, how is this, why is this move necessary if everything else will still be included or revealed in the financial statements and the annual report? Vally?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's a good question. As I understood it from the acting DG's explanation, I think it was quite clear to me. What he has made quite clear is that the reporting that results in what we call irregular, fruitless, and wasteful expenditure is not the same for all companies, because Eskom Transnet, besides reporting to the JSE standards, are also reporting to, I think it's IFRS, the global standard, which requires, for want of a better word, more stringent reporting. So in terms of that global reporting, which Eskom and probably Transnet subscribes to, these aspects that immediately becomes fruitless and wasteful expenditure has to be reported. So what the DG is saying is that to avoid that, but what he's saying is that it has to be reported, but to avoid that being triggered, it will not be reported in the financial statement. Because if it's reported in the financial statement, then that aspect kicks in. It becomes a fruitless expenditure. But if it's reported outside of the financial statement, but still being transparent and in the annual report, etc., then it's still clear and transparent to the public. But what it avoids, and this is where I'm supportive of it, it avoids triggering a qualified audit opinion. And as explained by the acting DG and myself, if that qualified audit thing kicks in, which I was also told by the DG that Eskom for the last 5 or 6 years did not have a qualified audit. So Mr. Godi, I'm not sure who's speaking the truth. But so to avoid that and to avoid the country plummeting into a blackout situation as a possible consequence of that, that's important. And also one more point, Kwena, we must be careful that we don't castigate the private sector unreasonably. Because the private sector is going to bring in the 254 billion rand of debt relief, whether it's locally or globally. So the private sector has a huge role to play. And even coming to the rescue of Eskom in the load shedding, the private sector will bring on the electrons onto the grid more speedily than the utilities. The utilities are cash-strapped, are making that comparison. Right? So we'll just be careful that we don't castigate the private sector unreasonably. We must just adopt a balance and so on. I'll hand back to you.
All right, we're running out of time. Hlathi, I'm just going to ask you then to give us your final comments in this situation. I mean, what would be, in your opinion, the way forward be in this regard to try and, I guess, maybe find a sort of an understanding and an amicable situation where the people will be comfortable with the move that has been taken? Hlathi?
Well, let me just quickly read. I always consult people who know better. He answers, he says, irregular expenditure will be published in the integrated report and not in the annual financial statement. And he says this was precisely the issue for Eskom delaying the release of the financials last year. So my parting shot is that we must be very clear that the same rules that we want our SO to be upheld by our SOEs are also upheld by the private sector. Unless we say the private sector can do as they please while they're doing business with the very same state institutions that are required to uphold the rules. My mind keeps saying that the private sector, if those was to be applied to them, this same level of scrutiny, a lot of people will be surprised. So the issue here really is that we must be very careful, as much as we are all angry with Eskom and the state entities, but it seems to me there's an absenteeism from those people who should look after our SOEs, because those of us observing from a distance, we see the rules being applied differently to the SOEs than they are applied to the private sector. The question is, maybe we should hand over everything to the private sector because the public sector is becoming more and more irrelevant in this government because the same rules do not apply. They are all in business. They have to be in competition between public and private. Same rules must be applied across the board. Thank you.
Right. Themba, just final bite from your side.
Yeah, thanks very much. My parting shot will be that this assertion that the credit rating and corporate assessment will be impacted must be unpacked so that we know the truth. Must not just be given a generic statement. And I must say that I don't have very high regard for the acting DG, knowing him from his days as a DDG at National Treasury, especially when it comes to dealing with the private sector. You can see from the letter of the minister that even the way the Auditor General must report has not yet been worked out. Where must the report of the Auditor General go? Must it go to the annual financial statements or must it go to the annual report? Will the annual financial statements be a true reflection of exactly what is? I mean, it's almost mafia style, and we're doing it publicly. Let's lie. Let's give them annual financial statements that does not show any wrongdoing. I think the Minister, Pravin Gordhan, Andre Director, and all those people that have been working around Eskom have actually wasted good time. If they had done this immediately when Ramaphosa came on board, then we would say, well, they have found an emergency situation that they're trying to address. But 5 years down the line, and you're taking us down this route, nah, I don't think that's it.
Themba, we're going to have to leave it there. But gentlemen, thank you so much for coming through. Hlathi and Themba for coming through to talk to us.